kind of cycle between these in a kind of repetitive fashion. So here you've got each of these identities is itself associated with a fund of autobiographical memory. When the person's in one identity, has access to one set of autobiographical memories. When the person's in another identity, has access to an entirely different fund of autobiographical memories. I'll talk about two such cases in just a minute. The fourth category of dissociative disorders are known as derealization and depersonalization. These are more episodic kinds of problems. They don't last for very long. They often occur under conditions of high stress. In depersonalization, the patient has the feeling that he or she is not the same person as he or she was before. It's not a change in identity, okay? It's not really a loss of autobiographical memory either. It's just that the person, in a sense, doesn't recognize himself, doesn't recognize that there's kind of continuity in identity. In derealization, you get the same kind of failure of recognition, but that failure of recognition is directed to the world outside as opposed to the person, him or herself. In derealization, the world just doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem like it's the way it used to be. The last time there was an outbreak of derealization was in the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, where a fairly large number of people in the Bay Area who were directly exposed to the earthquake just really felt that the world had changed quite radically. They just kind of didn't recognize where they were in. It's a kind of evanescent state, goes away pretty quickly. People make a full recovery from it, but while you're in this kind of state, things can be quite weird. These four syndromes, dissociative amnesia, dissociative fugue, dissociative identity disorder, and depersonalization, derealization disorder, often occur in association with some kind of traumatic stress. But it's not necessary for traumatic stress to be in the etiology. They can just happen, okay, for various kinds of reasons. Here's a classic case of multiple personality. One that was made into not one but two best-selling movies. The case study itself became a best-selling novel. This is Harvey Cleckley and Corbin Thigpen's case of the three faces of Eve, where one individual seemed to have three different personalities dwelling inside her. The index case, a woman known as Eve, known in this case study as Eve White, was a rural Georgia housewife, quite conventional in all respects, but she suffered from blackouts, and she was referred to physicians at Emory University for diagnosis and treatment. As the case proceeded, it became pretty clear that she was, in fact, not just a person who suffered from blackouts, which you might think of as a neurological disorder, but a person who suffered from multiple personality disorder. One of the other personalities was known as Eve Black, who was quite the opposite of Eve White. Whereas Eve White was quite conventional, rural, Georgia housewife, Eve Black was quite vivacious and seductive and gregarious and extroverted. And in fact, Eve Black came to light when one day Eve White received from Sears a mail order parcel, and when she and her husband opened it, there was this slinky black negligee, right, which was not the kind of thing that Eve White was used to wearing or Eve White's husband used to seeing. He said, "Kind of, where's this from?" Right, and it turned out that it had been ordered by Eve Black. Okay, then later in therapy, yet a third personality emerged, giving the case its title, "The Three Faces of Eve," Jane. What this tries to depict is a pattern of interpersonality amnesia that's quite quite common in these kinds of cases, where Eve White knew nothing about Jane or Eve Black. Eve White's memories were accessible to Jane, and they were also accessible to Eve Black. Eve Black and Jane knew about each other. So what you've got here is an asymmetrical interpersonality amnesia, where Eve White, for example, knew nothing about Eve Black, but Eve Black knew all about Eve White. This case got resolved, but then there was a kind of relapse later on. It's a very interesting case. If you're looking for reading over Christmas vacation or you want to watch a good movie, I recommend this to you very strongly. A more recent case is the case of Jonah, who was a serviceman, who was a guy in the army, who again suffered from blackouts, and in the course of diagnostic workup at the military hospital, was also discovered to be a multiple personality. Here, Jonah had actually 4 alter egos dwelling in him. One was Jonah. This is the presenting case. Jonah, who was quite shy and retiring, sensitive, didn't take criticism very well. And then there was a second personality, Sammy, who was also known as the lawyer, who was quite intellectual, read Sartre and Camus and the French existentialists and all of that, and was quite rational, known as the lawyer. And then there was a third personality, King Young, who was colloquially known as the lover, who was very pleasure-oriented, kind of a glib talker, smooth character in various ways. Jonah was black. I mention that only because his fourth personality was known as Usafa Abdullah, the son of Omega, or that was his name for himself, and otherwise known as the warrior, who was very cold and very hostile, very belligerent, very angry guy. And these 4 personalities kind of would come and go in various ways. In one episode, Jonah went to a bar, as servicemen are sometimes wont to do, and Sammy came out and started talking to people, and then King Young came out and started picking up other men's dates, right, hitting on other men's dates, which made the other men quite angry, confronted Jonah, at which point Sammy, the lawyer, came out and tried to talk these people out of this. Yeah, I didn't mean anything. It's all right. Don't worry. It's all good. And at one point, when one of the women's dates became particularly aggressive, Sammy disappeared and was replaced by Usafa Abdullah, who started a classic bar fight with wrecked furniture and the MPs being called and all sorts of things like that. In this one episode, you see the moving of personalities back and forth: Jonah, King Young, Sammy, and Usafa Abdullah. And Jonah had no idea about any of this. All he knew was that he suffered from blackouts, periods where he couldn't give an account for himself. And it turns out that those periods where he couldn't give an account for himself were the periods where Sammy or King Young or Usafa Abdullah was out and operating. Again, in this case, we had a very interesting pattern of interpersonality amnesia. Jonah knew nothing about any of this, okay? But Sammy had access to Jonah's memories, and King Young had access to Jonah's memories, and Usafa Abdullah had access to them. But Jonah just had no idea about any of this at all. And you kind of get this idea that when Jonah would be going around, maybe the other 3 personalities would be talking to each other, trying to figure out what they're going to do that night. They're going to go to a bar and pick up women and get into bar fights or whatever. These cases are very rare. Jonah is a famous case precisely because he's rare. Thigpen and Cleckley saw Eve in the early 1950s, wrote a book about it. On the basis of that book, for the next 20 years, people would send them other cases suggesting that they too might have multiple personality disorder. But in fact, Thigpen and Cleckley said they never saw another genuine case of multiple personality disorder. I've been in this business 40 years looking for these cases. I've seen one, okay? So they're very rare, but they're really interesting. And the reason they're really interesting, all these dissociative disorders are interesting, is because they raise fundamental questions about memory and identity and the constitution of personality. Here's an interesting case of dissociative fugue, one that's also quite famous. This is a British woman known as Jane Doe, as they often are, who was discovered by the police wandering around on the streets. She was disheveled. She was unclean, just physically dirty, not able to give an account for herself, not able to identify herself at all. When she was interviewed by a clinical psychologist, she had absolutely no autobiographical memory, and was unable to produce any identifying information at all. Classic presentation of hysterical fugue or psychogenic fugue. During the clinical evaluation, the psychologist, Lyons, decided that, okay, she doesn't have any autobiographical memory, let's test her fund of general knowledge, and he pointed to the telephone that was sitting on his desk, and he said, do you know what this is? And she said, well, yes, it's a telephone, okay? He said, well, do you know how to use it? And she said, yes. He says, well, show me how you use it. Show me how you use this. And she picked up the telephone and said, well, you hold it like this. And, well, what else do you do? And you dial a number. He said, dial a number. So she dialed a number, and before she could put the receiver back on the hook, Lyons took the phone from her. The person at the other end was the patient's mother. Okay? So here you have the discovery of something that we would now call an implicit memory. She didn't know who her mother was, okay? She couldn't give an account of what her own telephone number was or her mother's telephone number, but when asked to engage in this little procedure, okay, engage in activity, unconsciously apparently dialed her own mother's telephone number. Okay, so that's the dissociative disorders. It turns out there's another group of disorders, also quite interesting, known as the conversion disorders, which are also pseudo-neurological in nature. But whereas the dissociative disorders affect memory and identity, the conversion disorders affect perception and motor behavior. They consist of, first, what the 19th century authorities would have recognized as hysterical anesthesias. Hysterical tactile anesthesia, or blindness, or deafness, where the person has lost some kind of function mediated by the nervous system, mediated by the central nervous system, but in the absence of any evidence of a lesion. So these are hysterical anesthesias, problems of sensation and perception. Then there are hysterical paralyses, of which the most common are simple paralyses. The person can't move, but there's, again, no problem with the somatic nervous system, or perhaps the person won't be able to speak, just have hysterical aphonia. There's nothing the matter with the vocal apparatus, but still the person